everyone. I'm Augie Napoli, President and CEO of the United Way of Greater Cleveland.
I'm Danielle Sydnor, President of the Cleveland branch of the NAACP. Together, we are honored to present to the community this 10-part series of community conversations on the Cleveland Consent Decree. Each session will focus on an area of the consent decree and police reform through a conversation among experts and community leaders to provide insight and to re-engage the community.
The objective of these conversations is to provide a forum to raise awareness and increase community engagement on the consent decree and how it affects members of our community. United Way's mission is being a voice for those in need. We know that there are so many underlying aspects of poverty which are hard to see and equally hard to discuss and solve. And certainly systemic racism is a main contributor to generational poverty that has afflicted our community for far too long. Not one organization can solve inequity, and I am humbled to be only a small part of a group of esteemed community leaders from whom you will have the privilege to hear in this 10-part series.
For 108 years, the Cleveland branch of the NAACP has worked to improve the political, educational, social, and economic status of minority groups, to eliminate racial prejudice, and to keep the public aware of the adverse effects of racial discrimination, and to take lawful action to secure its elimination. This community conversation and the monthly topics we will address related to the Cleveland Consent Decree are right in line with the work our organization has addressed and championed every day for over a century right here in Cleveland. Through this series, you will hear about the current status of the Cleveland Consent Decree and the future of policing in the city. And as the name of this event suggests, this is a two-way dialogue, and we want to hear from you tonight and every month in this series as we tackle these various topics.
I'd like to thank Cuyahoga Community College and Rockwell Automation for sponsoring and making this series possible. I would also like to thank the City Club of Cleveland for partnering with us in hosting the series of events, and to be OVU for simulcasting this evening's discussion live on 95.9 FM. We'd also like to thank all of our community partners. Tonight is the first of the 10-part series, and to initiate the community conversations, we will discuss the background of the Cleveland Consent Decree so that we understand its purpose. We will explore the current status of the Consent Decree, what changes have been made, and what do we see as the future in police reform.
We are privileged to have as our moderator retired Cleveland Judge Ronald Adrine. The Honorable Ronald Adrine led and facilitated numerous court reforms, including special dockets to deal with drugs and mental health cases and those involving veterans. He has focused much of his career on advocating for victims of domestic violence. He established the Court Community Service Program, an alternative sentencing program that allows nonviolent offenders to pay for their crimes with community service. More than 400 local agencies have received millions of hours of work by people passing through the program. He chaired in 1994 the Ohio Commission on Racial Fairness, a group of judges appointed by the Ohio Supreme Court to identify areas of the justice system in need of reforming. Judge Adrine led the Free the Vote Coalition, an effort to inform Ohio inmates of their right to vote after they are released from prison. Judge Adrine has always been tough but fair, guided by a formula of 1 part penalty and 2 parts rehabilitation. So without further ado, I am honored to introduce tonight's conversation moderator, retired Judge Ronald Adrine.
Thank you, Augie and Danielle, for the introduction. And thank you to the United Way of Greater Cleveland and the Cleveland branch of the NAACP for inviting me to moderate this critical conversation. And most of all, thanks to those of you who have chosen to participate in this important dialogue. Unfortunately, the relationship between the Cleveland police and the Black community has not always been optimal. For instance, in 1966, the so-called Cleveland Little Hoover Commission found that the police division was, quote, defensive, isolated, and parochial, and mistrustful of the public it serves, unquote. In 1993, following the death of Michael Pipkins, a young Black man who was being held in police custody, I participated on a panel that reviewed the division's use of force policies. That panel issued a report with recommendations for reform. If those recommendations were implemented, they did little, if anything, to ease tensions and/or to lessen community distrust. So it's no surprise that during the middle of the last decade, a number of additional events transpired, which exacerbated those pre-existing concerns and resulted in findings by the United States Department of Justice that implicated the practices of the Cleveland Police Division. Those findings culminated in a decision by the city and its division of police to enter with the Department of Justice into the consent decree that is the subject of tonight's conversation. Let's talk a little bit about how we will interact as a community tonight. I will be moderating our panel of experts and pausing from time to time to respond to questions from you, our Zoom and listening audiences. There will be public question and answer segments where questions from the community will be heard and shared with our esteemed panel. You can start asking your general questions at any time during this evening's program. If you are on the Zoom meeting, use the chat feature to post your messages and your questions. If you're listening on either Facebook Live or on our WOVU 95.9 FM broadcast, you can text your questions to 216-307-5632. In either case, we ask that you pose questions rather than make statements, and that you make sure that your questions are respectful so that they will forward the dialogue. Our purpose is to illuminate and clarify exactly why the consent decree was deemed necessary, what the document attempts to accomplish, how its goals are being implemented, and lastly, but most importantly, to what degree this initiative is meeting with success. It is our desire to make sure that you leave this conversation more informed than when you came. Therefore, we will make every possible effort and attempt to address your questions before we close. Our time is limited, however, and there is the possibility that we may run out of time. Should that happen, please remember that this is just the first of 10 segments that the United Way and the NAACP will hold over the course of this year. There will be plenty of other opportunities for you to get an answer to any question that we don't get to tonight. Let me kick off our session then by briefly introducing our panelists for tonight. First, we have from the city of Cleveland, Chief Williams. Chief Williams, Chief Calvin D. Williams, is currently the Chief of Police for the city of Cleveland. He began his career with the Cleveland Division of Police in 1986. He was appointed as the city's 40th Chief of Police in 2014. Accompanying him from the city tonight is Law Director Barbara Langhenry. Director Langhenry has represented the city of Cleveland as a lawyer in the law department since 1990. and she was appointed to be the law director in 2011. From the consent decree monitoring team, we have Cleveland Police Monitor Hassan Aden. Chief Aden serves as the monitor overseeing the Cleveland Police Monitoring Team and is the deputy monitor for the City of Baltimore's consent decree as well. Accompanying him from the monitoring team is Deputy Monitor Ayesha Hardaway. Professor Hardaway currently serves as Deputy Monitor of the Cleveland Police Monitoring Team and is also the Director of Case Western Reserve University's School of Law, Social Justice Law Center, and the co-director of the university's Social Justice Institute. From the Cleveland Community Police Commission this evening, we have Executive Director Jason Goodrick. Mr. Goodrick is a native Clevelander and has served as Executive Director of the Cleveland Community Police Commission since 2017. And finally, but probably most importantly, from the community itself, we have the president of the Cleveland branch of the NAACP, Danielle Sydnor. Ms. Sydnor is the founder and CEO of We Win Strategies Group, a firm dedicated to working with a diverse array of stakeholders to create win-win outcomes for individuals, organizations, and communities. I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to lend your expertise and your perspective to tonight's dialogue. Let's go right to it. Let's get started. Director Langhenry, I'm going to start with you, and I'd like for you to explain to our audience just exactly what a consent decree is anyway.
Yes, thank you very much, Judge Adrine, and welcome everyone. The consent decree is essentially a settlement agreement that's entered into a judgment, entered into a decree by the court. And what happened was, in recognition of issues with the Cleveland Division of Police and with a desire to engage in constitutional policing and to have a good relationship with our community, the city, through the mayor, agreed to enter into negotiations towards a consent decree instead of engaging in civil litigation to resolve the Department of Justice findings that the Cleveland Police engaged in a pattern or practice of using unreasonable force in violation of the Fourth Amendment. And so the consent decree that we entered into outlines what the city would agree to do to reach certain goals. And Judge Adrine, I don't know if you want me to go through the elements of the consent decree at this time or
Just briefly, Barbara, if you could just give a thumbnail as to the top elements of the decree.
Sure, I'll try not to be tedious, but I think that it's important to understand what's in this document. It's 103 pages long and includes 462 paragraphs. It was signed by the city and the Department of Justice in May of 2015 and entered into the record as a consent decree by the Judge Solomon Oliver, in June of 2015. And it terminates upon the city's substantial and effective compliance with its material requirements. And the monitor evaluates whether the city is in substantial and material compliance, and they monitor our progress. The initial term of the consent decree's engagement with the monitor is 5 years, with 2 one-year extensions. We are currently in the first extension period of the consent decree. The decree itself was designed to ensure constitutional policing, particularly in the use of force, search and seizure, and crisis intervention, and to foster a strong relationship with the police and the community to improve community trust through outreach, transparency, and accountability. So broadly, there are 3 main areas that the consent decree addresses: use of force, Officers, as you know, are allowed to use force to do their jobs, but they must strive to use only the amount of force objectively reasonable as necessary to control a person. The other subject is crisis intervention, and this is how the police interact with people who are in a crisis situation, primarily mental health incidents, and stop, searches, and seizures. And this was an area where the Department of Justice did not issue any findings against the city concerning stop, searches, and seizures, but the city agreed to revise its policies, provide additional training, reporting, and enhance their data collection in this area. So in order to address those three subjects, the consent decree does that through increased community engagement, policy review and revision, accountability, and additional and enhanced internal review and oversight, enhanced data collection, and an analysis of equipment and personnel needs, along with revised and new training. So for community engagement, we created the Cleveland Police Commission to provide a formal way for the city to get advice from the community. And we'll be talking about the Community Police Commission later in this presentation in the process, but they have a mandate to engage with the community and to engage with the police. Further community engagement measures, we agreed to enhance existing district policing commissions. In each district, citizens generally meet with the police, with the district commander, and we agreed to enhance those existing commissions. We also agreed to implement a community and problem-oriented policing plan to include using methods and strategies to improve public safety and crime prevention through community engagement, training that promotes development of problem-solving partnerships with the community, and cultural competence and sensitivity. We also established a mental health advisory board made up of representatives from the community who work in that area to foster relationships and better support between the police and the community and mental health providers. We conduct community surveys under the direction of the monitor every 2 years of the consent decree. And we agreed to provide more transparency through providing certain information to the public, audits, reports, outcome analysis given to the police commission, posting of policies, procedures, training plans, etc. And then we also agreed to enhance our recruitment efforts with the police. For policy review and revisions, we had existing policies, but we went through all of our policies, particularly use of force reporting, use of force investigation, crisis intervention work, discipline, where we designed a disciplinary matrix, bias-free policing policies, and search and seizure policies. And that work is pretty much completed. We would revise our policies with the assistance of the Department of Justice, and the monitor and the judge approves those policies. In addition to that, we get input on those policies from the Police Commission. In particular, the search and seizure policy, we work very closely with the Police Commission when we revise those policies. The other way to address those things was accountability and enhanced internal review. We agreed to address some issues in the Office of Professional Standards and Police Review Board by increasing staffing, having tracking mechanisms, which included a procedures manual, and then the timeliness of our investigations. We agreed to address all of those. We made changes to how the use of force is investigated. Every use of force must be reported, and depending on the level of that use of force, it gets a different kind of investigation. We established a revamped force investigation team and established a force review board to review the work of those investigation teams to provide another level of oversight. And we also hired a civilian internal affairs supervisor. The internal affairs generally is the unit in the police division that investigates police misconduct. We also revamped internal affairs to ensure that the allegations of officer and misconduct are investigated fully, fairly, and efficiently. and that officers who engage in misconduct are held accountable. In addition to that, we agreed to establish and hire an inspector general. An inspector general is kind of like an auditor of police policies and procedures. That person reviews policies, audits compliance with those policies, conducts investigations, analyzes trends, develops recommendations for policy and training reform, analyzes the Office of Professional Standards investigations, collects and analyzes discipline to assess trends and determine whether discipline is consistent and fair. The other way we are working to achieve goals through the consent decree is we agreed to enhanced data collection. This is a transparency issue as well as a way for us to determine areas that may need concern and to determine areas where there have been successes. We hired a data collection coordinator. There's new data collection and analysis for stops, searches, and seizures, data collection and analysis for use of force, for crisis intervention activities, and for our community policing initiatives. We are collecting data on the interactions of the police with the community during their regular shifts. Data collection regarding recruitment, training, and data collection protocol and plan for evaluating the outcomes. In addition to that, we agreed to evaluate our equipment and personnel needs. So we upgraded our computer-aided dispatch system, instituted an inventory management system, provided for in-car reporting, which aids with data collection,
Director.
and evaluated all of our staffing needs and the deployment of the staff. And then finally, the consent decree provides for revised and new training to achieve our goals. And the training is in all of the areas that are a focus of the consent decree. So that's kind of a thumbnail view of what's in the consent decree.
I know it's a lot, and I hated to bump into you, but you know, we've got 5 other people that I want to make sure get an opportunity to be heard. But thank you for that overview. It just kind of shows the extent to which the city and the Department of Justice took a look at this entire issue. Let me move on to Attorney Brennan with the U.S. Attorney's Office. And Attorney Brennan, can you tell us what the predicates were that ultimately resulted in the development of a consent decree between the city and the Department of Justice?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting us to be part of this conversation, and to what looks like the 270 participants. I thank you as well. It's really important to discuss these issues openly and with all of each other, so thank you for participating. The consent decree, really to explain why it came to be, it's probably best to start back in 2013, which is candidly when our investigation really began. And at that point in time, we'd been seeing various lawsuits be filed against the city where people were complaining about Cleveland Division of Police policies, procedures, incidents. We had been following media reports of high level or high profile incidents. One was January 1st of 2011, involving a gentleman named Edward Henderson, who led police on a high-speed chase through the city the wrong way on 90. He fled his vehicle, but he was confronted by 2 officers, was compliant. He laid himself down on the ground at their commands. He was prone and then handcuffed. And, you know, during this, a helicopter is overhead capturing this interaction. And it ultimately captured 20 different heat images of police officers convening on what was ultimately determined to be the South Marginal. And several of those officers actually came in and kicked Mr. Henderson in the head and the upper body while he was handcuffed and compliant. It was staggering video. It was very concerning to us. About a year later, November 29th of 2012, we know, actually almost 2 years later, we all know about the incident involving Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams. the 137 shots that were fired. But ultimately what caught our attention was that then Ohio Attorney General DeWine, after BCI's conclusion of that investigation, indicated that it was their opinion that there were systemic failures within the Cleveland Division of Police. And then we also had individual complaints from community stakeholders and religious leaders, just saying generally there was a real divide between the community and the Division of Police at the time. And so with that backdrop, our office and prosecutors with the Special Litigation Unit in the Department of Justice, they work mostly from DC, began what turned out to be an 18-month investigation. And our authority for this is actually in the United States Code. It's section 14141. And it essentially says that, the federal government, the Department of Justice, can bring a lawsuit, can commence an action if it determines that there is a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing. And so that was what our investigation was trying to determine. So to that end, two remarkable prosecutors, trial attorneys here in our office, Michelle Heyer and Heather Volleson, and then attorneys out of DC, worked tirelessly, hundreds of interviews, community leaders, patrol officers, command staff with the Cleveland Division of Police, religious leaders, reviewed more than 600 use of force reports over a 3-year period. I think approximately 500 non-lethal use of force reports over the same time period. And it was the determination of our office and our partners in DC that there was a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing. And so ultimately there was a findings letter signed by our office and Mayor Jackson. It was signed December 4th of 2014 that essentially laid out the findings that Director Langhenry summarized for all of us.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. That kind of gives us some context about how we find ourselves where we are. I think we're at a point where instead of going to the next panelist, this might be a good place for me to introduce Peter Witt and ask Peter if there are any questions that have come in from the community that we can pose to the panel.
Yes. Anyway, hello, panel and everyone. I appreciate being a part of this, experience. So I do have a question from the community in terms of violence, and forgive me, I'm looking at my chat as they're coming through. But the one question is regarding this is, do you believe that actions taken to address the consent decree have led to material improvements in the life of citizens or visitors in Cleveland? If so, can you provide a concrete example? So that is one question that has come through so far.
Okay.
I can repeat that if I need to.
Yeah, repeat it again.
Yeah, and I'll slow down here. So do you believe that actions taken to address the consent decree have led to material improvements in the life of citizens or visitors in Cleveland? ? And then it says, if so, can you provide a concrete example?
Okay. Let me throw that out to the panel at large, but I think I'm going to specifically ask that Ms. Sydnor speak to it from the standpoint of what she's hearing from the street, and then somebody in the system itself can respond. Ms. Sydnor?
Absolutely. So good evening, everyone. I think Judge Adrine, in order to answer that question, it's really indicative of what you started with this evening about the fact that this consent decree is not the first time that action has been taken against this police department, and indicating that this is really emblematic of what we believe is a larger scale issue of just reform that is necessary in policing across this country. If we saw what happened with George Floyd, we have a number of local incidences that have happened that continue to describe to us that even with a decree, even with these asks of reforms, we as a community don't see this has gone far enough. And I think that the complaints that we still receive into our office, the number of incidences that have taken place in the city of Cleveland since the decree took place, really demonstrates to us that while we are seeing incremental reform, we absolutely do see some policies that have changed. We still, as a community, believe that we need to see more reform. And that's why conversations like this are so important, because the community is a really large part of helping the department to get to the place that they need to be.
Thank you. Chief, what does it look like from your standpoint?
Well, thanks, Judge. I want to thank the NAACP and of course, United Way for having us tonight for this conversation. But to get right to the crux of the question, I do believe there has been substantial improvements to the way we do business here as a police agency here in the city of Cleveland. I'm just going to go to some of the reality right now. Our uses of force are down. Our uses of deadly force are down. Our complaints are down. And our injuries to both officers and citizens are down. Specifically, use of force, deadly force, from 2011 through 2014 averaged about 20 a year, 20 per year. Some years we had 23, some years we had 21. If you look at our uses of deadly force from 2015 through 2020, we average approximately 4 per year. So we decreased that from 20 a year to 4 a year. Our uses of non-deadly force are also down. In 2018, the consent decree mandated that we implement counting of what's called pistol point, or drawing your weapon and pointing it at somebody, to categorize that as a level 1 use of force. So that increased our use of force numbers. But prior to that, our numbers went from in the high 300s down to the mid to low 200s. And if you take out the pistol points, we're still in the mid to low 200s yearly for use of force. Complaints, the same thing, from 400 or 500 complaints a year down to the low 200s to the mid 300s a year. So those are real numbers, and it speaks to real change. And people have to understand, we're still in the process of reform for this city and this division. We're not done yet. There's work to be done. So for the folks that say they haven't seen enough, I haven't seen enough either. So there's work for us to do, and we're committed to completing this work. Thanks, Judge.
Thank you. Does anybody else on the panel want to speak to the question?
And just before you do that, Judge Adrine, we want to just get the community, they're just trying to get clarity in reference to the word judge. Are you referring to Judge Oliver, I think, in your last question or statement? You stated the word judge, and it was like, was that in reference to Judge Oliver? That's just the community wanted to be clear about that.
No, I don't even remember using the word judge. So
well, it just came up. No worries. We'll keep moving. No worries.
Okay. Anybody else on the panel wanted to speak to the question that was raised? If not, are there any other questions that have come up, Mr. Witt?
We do have other questions. I did notice, just so that you that Mr. Goodrick had raised his hand, so I'm not sure if you want to have him respond to that, but I do see other questions. Your call,
Okay.
Judge.
I'm sorry, Jason, I didn't see your hand.
That's okay. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
Thank you to all the organizations for inviting the commission to be part of this conversation. The Police Commission, for those of you who don't know, is a volunteer group. 10 civilians who were appointed, and 3 police who are current or retired, who represent organizations within the Division of Police. And I am staff, so I am here on behalf of those 13 members this evening to give a little introduction to who they are. In regards to tangible change, I do want to just say, bring up the issue of the preamble of the consent decree. We get caught up in a lot of the nuts and bolts, what has to be done exactly, but the preamble is very important. One of those things is transparency. There is data. The law director mentioned they have data collection. The chief throws out data. And use of force, to the division's credit, has been a success based on the data the division has shared. But one of the words in that preamble is transparency. It's a major core value of this. And there's a difference between collecting data and sharing data. And I think it's very difficult to ascertain, other than through stories, where exactly we are in the consent decree without good, transparent data that's accessible. So I think Scene Magazine just recently initiated a lawsuit against the Cleveland Division of Police for not sharing use of force reports, which is quite a significant part of the consent decree, and it allows community members to see contradictory data that the city is putting out there and the division is putting out there, which is very important. The division has also stood their ground pretty hard where they have blocked or flat out denied some of the important requests from the Cleveland Community Police Commission when it comes to data and access to data, so that, while they'll provide some things, we're looking for the raw ability to look at data from a perspective that the community members would like to see it, not just what the division is saying it should be seen. So I know the DOJ and the Monitor have gotten involved in the data transparency issue, and I'm hopeful that there's going to be progress in this area in the future. But I think it's one of the challenges that we still have is what is the level of transparency for the future for the citizens of Cleveland? How deeply can they look into the Division of Police and these reforms to ascertain for themselves what is happening on the streets?
Okay. Peter?
Yes, sir. Judge Adrine, we do have some wonderful questions coming in, and so I'll take liberty of reading one that just came in, and I think it's maybe relevant to the last statement here. The question is, well, it's talking about misconduct. Misconduct investigations investigate whether the officer followed training, thus the officer is usually found to have followed the training and thus is not at fault, and is not held accountable. When will the training be changed to reduce deaths and officers being held accountable? So it's really referencing the training. It appears that once that training has taken place, the officer is usually found to have followed the training protocol and thus is not at fault or is not held accountable for actions. So the question is, will the training be changed to reduce deaths? Sounds like we talked about that, but more importantly, and officers being held accountable.
Can I get one of the representatives from the Monitor team to speak about this issue having to do with training and misconduct?
So I'll go ahead and jump in. I'm the court-appointed monitor, and for clarity, I just wanted to sort of advise the community what our role is. We have not really discussed that yet in terms of the lawsuit that brought this consent decree into being. The parties in this consent decree are the city and the United States Department of Justice. The monitoring team is brought on after the consent decree is enacted and is brought on by the federal judge. And in this case, Judge Oliver is who oversees and who we report to. But in terms of, I think for clarity also, I just want to just very, very briefly talk about when a consent decree comes into existence, there is a process for sort of laying out the steps. And the first steps, and this goes to both of the questions here, the first steps really are assessing all of the policies that are in place. And generally, these are policies that are around accountability, community policing and community engagement, use of force, technology, data, and equipment. All of these things are looked at. And subsequent to that is then a lot of work, and it takes years to go through and develop these policies. When they're developed, in order for them to be in effect, training needs to be developed, which also is extremely time consuming. To get the best training that's out there and to get it into the academy and in service, and to get this training delivered takes time and extreme coordination. The next phase is really watching all of these policies and practices and processes be implemented by the CDP and the city. And as that occurs, we begin to probe and we begin to take a look at use of force cases, specific cases. We sometimes do at random, we sometimes do entire batches. And we assess those against the training and the policies to ensure that they are in fact in compliance with the consent decree. We've done some major ones. You can see them on major assessments already. You can see them on our website. It's clevelandpolicemonitor.com. All of our reports are up there, updated. So the last steps, which take a couple of years, is where we're sort of heading to. And I know that there's a question later around this, but that is pure assessment. And we're going to be assessing all of the areas of the consent decree with regard to making sure that they are in compliance, but that it's also in practice, so that it's not just checking off the box and they're in compliance while we're here, but we're checking to make sure that if Chief Williams leaves, when we dissolve the consent decree and we leave, these things are in the culture of the CDP. So it's not just looking at data and saying, yeah, they're doing this now and checking it off. It's making sure that it's in the DNA of the CDP and the city.
So would you say, Chief, that over the course of the 5 years that there's been an increased level of accountability that the department has recognized as a result of all the actions that have taken consistent with the consent decree and the desire to change the culture?
Most definitely. Most definitely, there's been an increase in accountability, both from the investigations that Internal Affairs does, but also the Office of Professional Standards, which investigates civilian complaints that come in. So both have upped their game, and it's largely due to training, policies, selection of personnel to serve in these very, very critical roles. And, you know, again, as the consent decree matures, it's creating an environment where these things are solidifying into the practice of the CDP. So in the area of accountability, we're seeing progress. There is still, I mean, even as Chief Williams has said, there is a lot of work to be done. But from when we started this process to where we are today, there is a lot of work that has netted systems, processes, policies, and capacity in the CDP to comply with the consent decree and be able to deliver police services that the community deserves.
How satisfied are you with the transparency that Mr. Goodrick was speaking about?
I mean, I think that there are always ways to improve that, and it's a work in progress. I will say that there are areas that we would like to see improved with regard to data sharing. And I mean, I'll give you an example. If you go and look for a Cleveland policy right now, a Cleveland police policy on the city website or on the consent decree website, embedded in the city website, it's very difficult to find a specific policy. What you'll find is you'll find one PDF that has, you know, hundreds of pages with all of the policies listed in there. The city and the CDP have agreed to work with us, and we have a work group to really sort of peel back all the layers. So the average citizen can actually go to one place, find whatever policy that they're interested in, and click that one policy. They can download it. They can, you know, it's very basic transparency. And it's not unique to Cleveland. A lot of police departments do this for ease. They put everything in a PDF, throw it up, and say that it's accessible to the public, although it's very hard to navigate. But once we find these things and we work with the city on it, they're agreeable. And some of them are on the margins of the consent decree. They're not necessarily within the four corners of the decree, but we point it out to them as something that's necessary to continue to gain the public trust and continue to gain footing to become what they want to become, which the CDP states very clearly they want to become one of the best police departments in the country. And we're here to help them do that with this consent decree.
Okay. Peter, we've got about maybe 2-3 minutes.
Sure.
Back to the panel. Are there any questions that you see that might lend themselves to that kind of time frame?
Yeah, yes, I think so. I think I want to, this one question that's come up, and I have a second one if possible. Let me just send this first one out because it's around transparency. It may have been answered. Community organization called Surge. They say they have unsuccessfully attempted to monitor use of force incidents of the Cleveland Division of Police. Why has the division failed to provide use of force incidents? This may have been responded to, but I wanted to call that out as we were talking about transparency and communication. Should I repeat the question?
Yeah, that might be useful.
Sure. Surge has unsuccessfully attempted to monitor use of force incidents of the Cleveland Division of Police. Why has the division failed to provide use of force incidents?
Is anybody on either the commission or the monitor or the police department in a position to know what's going on with Surge?
Judge, this is Chief Williams. I don't specifically know of any requests from Surge about use of force, but I don't think the question is clear as to exactly what are they asking for as far as monitoring use of force incidents. So that would have to be something that would be clarified, and we definitely respond to that.
Okay, and I believe they were just talking about reporting from this interpretation, but I will also say that I'm reading the text that's been sent to me. Judge, I do have one other question. I think it could be relevant and answered in shortly here, possibly. I'd like to take a stab at it if you're okay with that.
That's good.
Okay, so the question is, and this is coming from media, Shannon Smith, reporter with 19 News. What are some of the changes people can see to when it comes to policing, forgive me. Let me read this over. What are some of the changes people can see to when it comes to policing due to the consent decree? What happens after the 10 months of discussion?
Anybody want to take that on? I guess it wasn't as simple as you thought, Peter.
That's okay. But, it's food for thought, right? And we could come back to it as we continue. So at this point, I'll let you
jump right in on that if I could.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this format that's been set up by United Way and NAACP, it's just that. It's a format to get information out to the community. But we haven't stopped working. We're not going to do 10 months and then go back to work or, see what's developing. We're constantly working on this consent decree and other things that really don't even relate to the consent decree here in the city and the division. So I think what people can look forward to is further reductions in use of force, further reductions in complaints, more community engagement. Our community engagement was really supposed to start in earnest in 2020. But everybody kind of knows what happened in 2020. So it was hard to really get true community engagement started for the division. So we hope 21 here real shortly will give us the opportunity to get back out and talk to folks face to face, and also to get that data that a lot of folks have been talking about into our systems so that we can really kind of quantitatively and qualitatively look at our community engagement throughout the division and throughout the city.
Okay, thank you. Chief, you're sort of at the tip of the spear, and so I think it probably is appropriate for us to maybe turn and hear from you, because pretty much everything is going to come across your desk at one point or another. When the division, and I'm talking about now from top to bottom, first became aware of the fact that the city had entered into a consent decree that required that they undertake all of these kinds of new initiatives, what would you suggest was the general attitude within the department, and were there any kind of morale things that you had to deal with?
That's a great question, Judge. I don't think there were any morale issues. It was pretty new to us as far as this process. But I think just like any agency or organization out there of a few thousand folks, people are reluctant to be criticized. I mean, you think you're doing a good job overall, and people come in and criticize you. Sometimes that's a hard pill to swallow. But we swallowed, and we swallowed hard. When the findings letter initially came out in December of 14, we accepted that findings letter, not in totality, because we thought there were a lot of things in there that we were accused of doing that we didn't do. But there were a lot of things in there that we were guilty of doing. So we accepted the letter in its totality, and we embarked upon this process of putting together a consent decree that would address all the issues that not only Department of Justice, but that our community had complaints about. And as Chief Aden said earlier, my commitment back in 2014 and 15 was to make this the best police division in the country, bar none. And I think we've done a lot of work towards that. But again, there's still a lot of work to do. And I think this helps us a lot, because hopefully there are people on this call and on the future sessions here going forward in 21 that will come forward and work with the division and with our partners on making this consent decree what it should be, and on making this the best division in the country.
What would you say, as you look back over the course of the last 5 years, was the greatest challenge to implementation of the consent decree that you had to address?
Judge, that's a great question. Of course, with a document of this size, the director talked about the 103 pages, the 200 plus paragraphs that all have to be addressed. For me, the biggest, I think, challenge is the time that it actually takes to really get something done that's sustaining. It takes time to review policy. It takes time to actually research best practices and things like that to come up with a better policy. It takes time to go out to the community to see what they think about what you're coming up with. It takes time to actually draft that policy, get it approved, and then it takes time, once it's approved, to write the curriculum, to get the training out to the guys and girls that have to actually implement the stuff on the field. And it takes time to now go back and see if that training is really doing what it's supposed to do. So for me, it's just that time factor of getting the things done.
I know that you've spoken on a number of occasions about your level of pride in the community and problem-oriented policing model that's being developed by your division. You want to talk a little bit about how that fits within the rubric of the consent decree?
Well, the consent decree, like the director went over, I put it in 7 different categories. The main categories, I start with community engagement as one of the first and foremost categories in getting things done. And then there's use of force, crisis intervention, there's search and seizure, accountability. And I also add a 7th category to that, and that's that training that has to be done to our division members. But our CPOP, which we call it, which has been categorized as, I think that's the most important part of this consent decree, getting the public involved, hearing from the public, and having the citizens of this city actually have a hand in how policing is done, how issues are solved throughout the city. And I've said from the beginning, even before we developed CPOP, we wanted to do a program called CPR, Community Respect, community, professionalism, and respect. When I go talk to our members, I tell them I only require two things: professionalism and respect for our community. And if we can get those two things done, then a lot of this other stuff kind of goes away. So the CPOP plan is just that. It's developed to make sure our community has a hand and the voice and all the things that happen related to how our community is policed. And I think it's a great start to getting to where we need to be.
Okay. So as you've rolled this out over time, have any of the areas that you've undertaken caused you any level of disappointment where you thought that there was more progress that could have and should have been made than what you actually experienced?
Honestly, Judge, all of them. I mean, we're always looking to get better and better. I cited some of the stats of use of force. We want those to be zero, but unfortunately we live in an urban area and there's going to be force used. So I want zero uses of force, but if we have force, which happens in an urban area, I want that force to be used to be, we have three standards for it. That is necessary, is proportional, and the constitutional standard of being objectively reasonable. If our officers meet those standards on uses of force, then we're okay. And then we add a third standard, de-escalation. We have to make sure that we try to de-escalate as much as possible before there is a use of force. And in a lot of cases, majority of the cases that we see here in the division, that happens to an extensive degree before any force is used. And I like to say that our officers used to run from call to call to call. Prior to this, we tell them, take your time on each call so that you can get the things done so that we can resolve that call in a peaceful manner.
Okay. Thank you. Director Goodrick, can I come to you at this point and have you just give a quick overview of exactly what the function of the Community Police Commission is and who's on it? I think you already actually told us who's on it, but can you tell us a little bit about exactly what it's supposed to accomplish?
Sure. So the Community Police Commission is supposed to be there to help the division build a relationship with the residents of the city of Cleveland and the people who come to work in the city of Cleveland, anybody who can be affected by policing by the Cleveland Division of Police. It's a novel thing in Cleveland, and like all novel things, it sounds easy on paper, but as we're 6 years in, we're finding out it's not always rainbows and butterflies when you're trying to put community input into policing that has never had community input really at this level. So the Cleveland Division of Police has had community engagement since the beginning of existence in one form or another, but this is a little bit different. What the commission does is bring community voice into policy. So this is the world that the police have to live in, is their policy. So the way we handle that is the model that we've gone to that's been working really well is, if we take a problem or if the chief were to call us and ask us to work on a problem on the division's behalf, what we would do is we would take that to the community at large and ask them, hey, let's put all of our collective brains together and solve this issue and bring the chief some good feedback and suggestions that can work on the streets. And at times we've had large groups work on this in big community meetings, and other times it's been small groups. So if it's a very technical issue, like search and seizure was, we brought in some of the best legal experts and legal minds in the city of Cleveland to work on helping make the search and seizure policy the best that it can be, using their expertise to bring that to the chief. And the one thing I'll say about it is the model is exceptional in the way that it works, because it's people willing to do this with their own time. So the civilians here, some of them would be paid extraordinary amount of money to lend this expertise. And here they are volunteering time and energy into working on police policy for free. So, in other environments, the public sector, corporations would pay top dollar to get this level of a think tank to help solve problems. And I think through the past 5 years, the quality of that has really increased. And there's really some great recommendations that have been made across that time period, from search and seizure, bias-free policing. We worked with the division to help develop their first youth interaction policy, which is a giant leap forward. And I will say, to the division's credit, they went above and beyond the consent decree to develop with the community through us a policy that specifically deals with youth. We know that the 26-year-olds and below have the greatest contact with the police, and for the division to take that extra step and say, you know what, we're going to spell out how that relationship is supposed to go in the future. I have to say that's a credit, one of the greatest successes of the commission and the division working together to bring something like that. They also did that with the transgender community, another policy that was not in the consent decree that they worked with the commission on to bring to the table and get it done. So that's really our model. It hasn't been without its bumps in the road, but I think as we're moving forward, it is an introduction to a new dynamic in Cleveland that hopefully will last beyond the consent decree, and that is a flow of information both ways. So we're talking about access, that transparency issue, right? So we can bring information and analyze information that's going on in the division, get community perspective on it, and bring it back to whoever is leading the division in the city, the safety director, the mayor, and say, hey, this is where we're at. What do we need to do? How can we solve some problems related to this or celebrate successes?
Judge Adrine, this is Peter. I just want to recognize I have some questions in the queue that I'd like to present before we get too far off this last recent segment of speakers, if that is okay. Uh-oh. Can you all hear me? I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. Judge is muted. So the questions I want to present, and this is directly to, it's a question for Ms. Sydnor, Danielle. The question is, does the consent decree, in your opinion, measure the right performance metrics, and what metrics do you suggest reflect real reform? So would you like for me to repeat that?
No, I have the question. So one, I want to start by saying I don't purport to be the expert on policing. I think that we have a number of individuals on this panel, and one we haven't heard from yet, who I'm dying to hear from, Ayesha Hardaway, and others who have worked extensively on matters related to this. But to answer what I can of the question, I would say that the consent decree, which we've heard several people articulate this evening, is just a bit of an observation of issues that were prevalent in the department. And so did it encompass every single thing that presents an issue to the community? No, but it did identify, I think, as the Department of Justice representative expressed this evening, some very explicit cases that had happened in a pretty truncated time period that indicated to us that absolutely there is a pattern and practice of behavior that needed to change. And so what I see in the consent decree is really the burning red flags that it's like, there's no way we can move forward as a community and a police department together if at minimum these types of issues are not addressed. But I think what we see happening is with the Community Police Commission and individuals like Jason and his team are also bringing to the table issues that may not have been explicitly in the decree that we also know disproportionately impact the community, and are using this opportunity to be able to bring those issues to bear to try and provide some resolution.
Thank you. Ms. Hardaway, would you like to respond? Ms. Sydnor opened the door for you, and I'm gonna allow that to happen. So would you like to add to that, any perspective on that last question?
Actually, no, and I recognize that I haven't spoken yet. I absolutely am willing to. I think she has answered the question that was directed to her just fine. Sure. So Judge Adrine, one other question. I want to really direct this to Chief Williams. It was directed towards you, Mr. Chief Williams. And I think it's an important question to ask. I think you can validate this or not. The question read, per Chief Williams' point about starting community engagement in 2020,
why would community engagement start 5 years after the consent decree? So I just want you to either confirm or clarify for the public.
Sure, that's a great question. I answered the question to Judge Adrine earlier about the biggest challenge, and I said it was time. That's one of the reasons. That's kind of how it fell within our working of the consent decree. Use of force was first and foremost, first thing that we worked on right out of the gate. The community engagement, the CPART part of that failed, 2-3 years down the line, which is unfortunate. As I stated earlier, when we started this process, my biggest, the thing I wanted to work on the most was the community engagement aspect, because, a lot of the questions that have come really are, how does this affect the community? How is the community going to know it's actually working? How's the community feel when we do certain things out there? And the only way that happens is if we have an aggressive community engagement process that really puts our officers out there with the folks day in and day out, talking to people, listening to people, working out problems with our community. But again, that's just the time frame that the official CPOP plan fell into place. But I just want to be clear, we've had community engagement for a long, long time. Before the consent decree was implemented, and during that first 3 or 4 years before 2020, we've had community engagement. Our officers are out there now doing community engagement, not to the degree that we want them to, not really following the exact CPOP plan, but they're still doing community engagement. Our officers do things around Christmas time. They do things year round with families in need, with our community folks in need, with our youth in need, at schools, at rec centers, you name it. Our folks are constantly engaged in community policing and community engagement. And just real quick, and I know we're pressed for time, just one story about community engagement. I was on the scene back in 2016 or 17, I want to say. I can't remember because these all sometimes run together. Unfortunately, a homicide scene of a child that was killed in a drive-by shooting. And there were officers on the scene that were actually going to the trunk of their car to get more crime scene tape to expand that crime scene to make sure we collected all the evidence connection with that horrific and senseless crime. And as the officer opened his trunk, as I was passing by, he had a bag of footballs, little miniature footballs, and another bag of teddy bears in the trunk of his car. And I asked him, where'd you get that? What do you do with that? And he said he and his partner, with their own money, bought it, and they give it out to kids in the neighborhood. When they see kids, they stop and play catch with kids. And this was something that I didn't tell them to do. This is something their commander didn't tell them to do. These two officers took it upon themselves to buy with their own money things that they would hope would brighten a kid's life here in the city of Cleveland. And that's just one example.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay. I think this might be a good time for me to bring Professor Hardaway in to talk about the recently released 8th semi-annual compliance progress report and things that she sees as a highlight, or highlights, I should say, of that report. So Professor, you want to talk about that a little bit?
So the 8th semi-annual report, that's the one from basically the beginning of the pandemic, I'd say, the summer.
Okay.
We have the 9th semi-annual report, which will come out in February. There will be, as always with these semi-annual reports, a status conference in before Judge Adrine. It'll be virtual, the second time that will be virtual. The judge makes space for community to participate or listen in on those status conferences. And so I would encourage those who are interested in following along with this work and seeing how the judge is interacting in this process to follow the prompts and to log in, much like tonight for the 9th semi-annual report. As it relates to the 8th semi-annual status report, I think most germane to the conversation that we've been having here tonight is that we were able to identify some progress, which we've talked about some here as it relates to policies and documentation of things and the drafting of new policies. That report did speak to the need for greater capacity around training and working with the division to make sure that they have adequate capacity to then train officers on the new policies that have been created. And it also spoke really clearly to the need for the city to find ways to be more closely connected and collaborative in their engagement with the Community Police Commission and the community writ large as a product of that. And so that is some of what we talked about in the 8th semi-annual report. The 9th semi-annual report, as just a little bit of a preview, we've mentioned in a filing, will be in two parts. One part, a review of the aftermath of the protests and the demonstrations following the killing of George Floyd, and then a more truncated status or compliance report, the more traditional compliance report. So it'll be in two parts next month, and I hope I answered your question, Judge.
You did. Can I ask you one more, since I've got you on the camera at the moment? Can you kind of set out for us the difference, or I should say the role of the Inspector General vis-a-vis the role of the Office of Professional Standards under the consent decree? What's the difference between those?
All right, this is feel like a law school exam. No, I'm joking. So the Office of Professional Standards is the civilian component of, and normally the parallel or the comparison is with internal affairs. So the internal affairs superintendent investigates misconduct discovered internally within the division or brought to the division internally. The Office of Professional Standards is the civilian arm that was the result of passage through legislation with City Council. That department is a civilian investigative unit that then reports their findings and recommendations to the Civilian Police Review Board. The Office of Professional Standards, when we came in 2015, was in dire shape. I'll leave it at that. They were in dire shape, and fortunately, through some hard work on the part of the city, have reorganized, revamped, and made sure that investigations that were long outstanding and had not been resolved have been cleared and addressed, and that we've been moving forward. They hired a new administrator within that department. But for the purposes of the community here tonight, you should know that if there is a complaint about police misconduct, that they want to go through a civilian review process, that they should file any of those complaints with the Office of Professional Standards.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pose one more question, then we're going to go back to the community's questions. So Chief Aden, can you tell me what steps have been taken to address the use of force concerns that were raised by the findings of the Justice Department?
So I think that goes to what we've already talked about, but essentially it's creating policies around use of force, but not just use of force, but accountability structures, the training that the officers are given, and the training is outstanding. Many of us on the monitoring team have participated in training and overseen the training, but it really goes into something that Chief Williams mentioned, which is a de-escalation piece. If that piece is missing, there are many situations that start off as just an encounter that can escalate very, very quickly to a use of force. De-escalation in policy, many police departments have it in their policies, but this policy takes it a step further. You have to de-escalate, but then the officers have to articulate the steps that they took to de-escalate. You can't just say in your use of force report, I attempted to de-escalate the situation and it didn't work. And then I used my pepper spray and a baton. You have to specifically talk about what those efforts are. And by putting it into that format, officers are held accountable to de-escalating every single incident. And sometimes it's not feasible. There are incidents where things are moving so fast, de-escalation is not possible. But in the cases where de-escalation is possible, those cases force the officers to do so. And what we found is that has sort of taken the pressure off of regular encounters. We all know people that can get into a situation and they can just cause conflict just by the way they look at somebody, and I'm not talking about just in policing, I'm just talking about, like, I look at my own family. I've got, family members that they walk in a room and they've got conflict swirling all around them. De-escalation is an art form, but it can be trained. You can hold people accountable to it, and it does have a very positive impact. The other piece is the force investigation team that has been created along with our policies. These are folks that know the right questions to ask. They know how to interview officers while they themselves are sworn. They know how to interview officers. They know how to go down all the rabbit holes and sort of create a very tight, very comprehensive investigation around the use of force. There's also the Force Review Board that's been put in place. That is just starting to occur. I believe we have the first one in February. So I believe it's next week. And that is a body of people, not all sworn, that take a look at certain categories of use of force. And they look at it from the perspective of policy, process, training, equipment. And it's essentially created to comprehensively review a use of force and provide feedback that essentially is geared at continuous improvement, so the division can continue to improve how it investigates force, what kind of equipment the officers have or don't have and need to get. All of these things. A Force Review Board is very, very advanced, and it's a big plus. It's going to be a big impact to the city. The other thing is body-worn cameras. Although they weren't explicitly in the consent decree, the city has adopted them, and they are in use in patrol and in other division or other bureaus of the police department. And those certainly help to create a record of the use of force, but also help to de-escalate certain things. So there's a lot more, but in the interest of time, I've condensed it to just those things. We're right now underway assessing force. We've got 2018 and 2019 cases, a multitude of them, and we'll be issuing a report on that probably in the early summer.
Okay, thank you. Peter, I think we're back to you. Let's hear from the people.
Sure. So I have 3 questions that I want to present from the people, as you say, Judge Adrine. And so the first one, I think Chief Williams referenced community engagement. However, the question is there a training program for officers to engage more in the community, and are there any classes? You may have referenced it, but I'm calling out the question specifically.
Chief?
Yeah, the answer to that question, yes, there is a training program. But again, we were supposed to have started that program in 2020 and COVID hit, so it shut a lot of that down. So there is an approved training program for community engagement that hopefully we can get back to and actually do that standardized training throughout the division here in 21.
Great. The second question, if I can ask this, Judge Adrine, is: are there any requirements for officers to be trained in trauma-informed care? And I think we just referenced this last point, in interviewing techniques. Are there any requirements for that?
Yeah, Judge, the answer to that question is our detectives, especially in our special victims unit, that includes homicide, sex crimes, and domestic violence. They do have that interview technique training. We also have within those particular bureau, actual clinicians and our support folks, be it from Rape Crisis or from the County Witness Victim Center, to actually help in those investigations and those interviews of victims in those particular crimes. Our frontline folks, no, not so much. The trauma-informed piece has kind of been a recent addition to a lot of law enforcement here in the last 2 or 3 years. And we are working closely with the city because there's a program that the city has with all of our neighborhood resource centers where they actually have those trauma coaches and folks in the rec centers. So we're trying to make sure we partner with those folks to get that particular training through the city.
Thank you. And the third question, Judge Adrine, is, I think it's more of a clarifying question. I'll ask. Cuyahoga Metropolitan Housing Authority, Regional Transit Authority, Cleveland Clinic, and other police units operating within city limits are not covered by the consent decree. And it's like correct. So they're just wondering if that's the correct understanding of the coverage of the consent decree.
Actually, those agencies are covered. They're not officially a part of the consent decree, but we have memorandums of understanding with all those agencies that operate within our borders. And as part of those MOUs, I think back in 16, we actually put requirements for them to train in the same use of force policies, the same CIT policies, the same community engagement things that we're going to start here, as well as search and seizure within their agencies.
Thank you. So Judge Adrine, we do have other questions, but I may defer. You have a hand. Hassan has hands up there. So.
Okay.
But for clarity, I think that's a really great question about those other police departments. We don't monitor them. They are not part of our oversight.
Okay. Great.
But if I understand it correctly, Chief Williams, even though they're not specifically covered by the monitoring agency, if they're functioning within the borders of the city of Cleveland, you have developed some methodologies to kind of keep tabs on what's going on with them.
That's correct, Judge. We have developed the collaboration, and of course we have with all those agencies that operate within our borders, and they have signed on to do the exact same training that we're doing in those areas that I mentioned. They weren't forced to do it. We had discussions about it in 2016 and 17, and when we renewed those MOUs with those particular agencies, they signed on. It makes sense that all the folks that police within the borders of the city, we all police basically the same folks, that everyone would have that same level of training.
Okay. Let me take a minute just to remind the people who are listening on the radio that you're not shut out. You can ask questions too. You can text your questions to 216-307-5632. Again, 216-307-5632. So, and we will field your questions as we're fielding some of the others. Peter, we still have a little bit of time that we can devote to doing this. So let's go back to the questions from the community.
Sure. So the next question I have for the panel, Judge, is reference to professional standards. It may have been responded to. I would still ask the question. Can someone address what kind of progress has been made in the Office of Professional Standards regarding citizens' complaints? Now, I think Ms. Hardaway responded earlier. I'm just bringing it back up because it came up again.
Okay. Professor, you want to talk a little bit more about it?
Yeah, I just had to come off of mute. Thank you, Judge. Yeah, there was a significant backlog back in 2015, 2016. That backlog was cleared out of old cases. The Office of Professional Standards is more has more staff than they had before. There's still some slight staffing needs, but they have more staff than what they had before. They have a policy manual that details how investigations should be conducted, as well as the timing around notification for complainants and witnesses, and then information on training on how to write reports so that they can make recommendations to the Civilian Police Review Board. So from the monitoring standpoint, what we initially saw with the Office of Professional Standards has been greatly improved.
So Judge, let me continue with the other questions while we have time. So this is one is, how does the commission safeguard against implicit bias? It's a pretty big question.
Yeah, that's a pretty huge question. I'm not sure anybody's going to really be able to figure that one out. And if they are, I want to get with them because we need to go into business with each other.
Well, it was a question presented, and I didn't want to leave that at least not referenced. Like you said, it's a tall order.
Yeah, it's a good question, Peter. I'm just saying. But does anybody want to talk about what steps are being taken to try to address implicit bias within the force?
It looks like Barbara, did you have your hand up?
See?
The consent decree does address bias, and there are provisions for policies on bias-free. There's a bias-free policing policy. In addition to that, the officers have received training on that bias-free policy, as well as cultural competency training. Those are some of the explicit ways that it is addressed in the consent decree. In addition to that, a component of the CPOP program that the chief spoke about earlier, really the main component is officers getting to become very familiar with the districts or the areas in which they work, meeting people in the community on face-to-face level on the streets. I mean, part of it involves bike and foot patrols getting out of their vehicles so that they can interact with people. And that kind of personal engagement and knowledge of a community hopefully also will try to wear away at some of the biases people may bring to their work. Those are some of the ways that it's addressed in the consent decree.
Director Goodrick, let me just give you the opportunity maybe to speak to the whole question of bias-free practices mandated under the consent decree and what your perspective is as to how that's working for the department.
Sure. And again, I'm this is aggregate of a lot of the community feedback that we get. The community has deep concerns about bias. We know this. Going back to the DOJ investigations, it's one of the most frequently cited items in our community meetings over a period of time. When we look at the data from our minutes over 5 years, people still to this day have deep questions about bias-free training, and it's how it works its way down to the officer level. Lots of different opinions on how to do it, but I want to circle back to what we started with, and that's history, right? So, I think the community still comes to us with a lot of concerns about history, because in any relationship, when it's complex, like the one between the Cleveland Division of Police and the community it serves, you just like a marriage or a friendship, you can't just say, well, history doesn't matter, right? We can't just skip over that. One of the things the community brings to us a lot is when the DOJ did their investigation, racism wasn't mentioned in there. So from the start, a lot of people are still asking to have more conversations around how race affects policing in Cleveland. And just saying, well, we did some bias-free training, I don't think right now the community is feeling the effects of that at the level, especially with the national resurgence of how history seems to be repeating itself. And I know that Cleveland, the use of force data is a little bit different, but it still is there. It's palpable at our meetings, the issue of race and relations, particularly with the Black and brown neighborhoods. Truth and reconciliation is one of the things that is brought up frequently. Again, going to the preamble of the consent decree, I think it specifically says the CDP and the community must have a relationship built on trust and mutual respect. Okay, we can't skip over those difficult conversations about what has happened. And I think when the chief says he doesn't, the leadership and the chief says, well, we don't necessarily still to this day agree with everything we've been accused of, it creates a significant challenge to saying and sitting down in a room with the community and saying, well, let's talk about some hard things when the community wants to start with, well, can we talk about what happened to me? Can we talk about what happened in this neighborhood? I'm still not healed from that. I'm still not okay with that. So it's something we hear a lot. And I think history is the key. One of the big elements of bias-free policing is having some deeper and open conversations about history and how that history affected the neighborhoods in Cleveland, particularly the Black and brown neighborhoods, and how we do that going forward. The commission certainly could be a great venue for the division to have those hard conversations still. As we close, I just want to make sure everyone knows that if you're interested in working with the commission as a community member, please seek us out. You can look at our clecpc.org website. That's a good place to start. You can send an email to info@clecpc.org or follow us on social media. We're on Twitter at CLECPC and Facebook, Cleveland Community Police Commission. So any one of those ways you can get in touch with us to find out how we're having meetings, to have these hard conversations, to work on many of the issues of the consent decree that have been talked about tonight. We have work groups that are related to those, and they're open to the community to get in. So, the most powerful thing you can do is show up. If you really, truly believe in changing the future of policing in Cleveland, come to our meetings, get your butt in a seat there and sit down and tell us what your vision of policing is.
Judge, I want to make a point, going back to the actual question, which was around implicit bias. I just want to be clear that there is no training that will end implicit bias or will end bias. It's implicit. So we all bring bias wherever we go. And one of the key things that we try to get into the training is the notion of recognizing your bias and disrupting that bias. Again, we all have it. There is no bias-free environment. We need to train the officers on how to recognize it and how to disrupt it. And if that is successful, along with the accountability structures that if bias is discovered, that's a short-lived badge in terms of they need to be terminated. But again, a lot of times I'll hear, the bias-free. Nothing is bias-free. We try to teach, and I'm not saying necessarily with the lesson plans here in Cleveland, but across the country in policing, we focus on having officers understand what it actually is and disrupt it and not bring it into a law enforcement contact.
Judge, I would like to add in, just as you asked that question about bias, one of the things that struck me this evening, I think we can't help but also acknowledge the difference in response that we saw to protesters in Cleveland from insurrectionists at the Capitol this past January. And so when we look at this conversation about bias, and even a comment that Chief Williams made this evening, there's generally a belief that in urban communities, you're going to have to use some level of force. And so we think about the ways that we are responded against, there becomes this inherent kind of bias and implicit belief that there's going to be a certain level of force that has to be used. And so I think as we continue to grapple with this conversation, Jason also mentioned it, is the community really needs to hear, we're sorry, we did the wrong thing. We know that even we continue not to get it right all the time. As a parent, it is the most humbling thing to apologize to your child when you get it wrong. I don't have to. I'm the authority figure. I can say, if you want to stay in my house, I get to make the decisions, deal with my bad attitude. But it's humbling for me to say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I hurt your feelings. I didn't do the right thing. And so what the community needs, if we're going to move forward in a way that we can work together, is to have that acknowledgement, to have it consistently. The decree is not the only time there was an acknowledgement that something went wrong. There are consistent things that even have happened since the decree went into place. And the community is aware of that. We live it, we see it every day. And so while we acknowledge the progress that is made, the community, and I'm speaking as a member of the NAACP and as a mother of 2 Black sons, we are at a place where we are no longer comfortable with just incremental progress. We are looking for radical imagination that says we can look at how to make communities safer in a different way. And what role does the community, does the police play in that? They play a portion of that, but we also have to talk about prevention and all those other things. And while we allocate budgets, we have to acknowledge that that's all a larger part of this conversation. So I'm grateful that we are using this forum to start this 10-month series. And I do hope that every single time we come back, we don't have 200 people. We continue to grow this, because these individual focus areas over the next 10 months will really determine how we help the department move forward and making that radical shift.
Hey,
Thank you.
Judge.
I think that one of the things that ought to be added to the last 2 speakers is that they are absolutely correct when they're talking about the fact that everybody can have a piece of this. You know, this is not just something that people in positions of authority or people who have a title can make a difference. Everybody can have a piece of this, and to the degree that you feel energized by it, and I think that it's absolutely imperative that you make your voice known and that you step up. The one good thing about this consent decree is that it has presented the city of Cleveland with a vehicle where you can actually make your input and make everybody aware of how you see things going as we move forward. And there's no such thing as a question that was a wrong question, except the one that isn't asked. And so every question carries with it the possibility that your answer, even if you thought it was a stupid question, may actually be the question that needed to be asked in the moment. Chief, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, Judge, if I could real quick, I have to push back just a little bit on this piece about bias. By preferencing this with, growing up in this city as a Black youth, poor in this city, I know about bias. And I'm not going to start by saying that there is no bias on the Division of Police, period. I'm not going to say that, but just a little bit of factual data. I know Mr. Goodrick talked about the folks that he encounters that comes to their meeting that talk about bias and how they've been treated. I get that. I'm not going to discount that. But if you look at the last 2 reports from the Officer of Professional Standards, which takes those civilian complaints when they think they've been wronged by a Cleveland police officer, if you look at the 18 and 19 report, the report that there was some bias felt by that citizen on the part of an officer in both of those years is less than 1% of the total complaints filed against Cleveland police officers. It's just a fact. Now, does that mean there was no bias involved in other aspects of that complaint? I don't know, but the way they categorize it, bias was less than 1% for 18 and 19. So that's just a fact. Take a look at their report. It's their own report. They're separate from us. This thing about the treatment of folks and how they feel about that and how police different groups differently. I can, people bring up the Capitol riots and how there was a predominantly Caucasian group versus some of the protests over the summer, which weren't all predominantly African Americans, but it had a good bit of African Americans in most of those protests. I challenge people to look back at prior to May 30th. Look at the protests and the First Amendment activities, even Second Amendment activities that have taken place in the city, and how the Cleveland Division of Police has policed those constitutionally protected activities. We haven't had complaints. We haven't arrested folks en masse. We haven't had uses of force in those prior events. So again, I ask people to look at the facts. I know there's a lot of anecdotal. I know there's a perspective that people have about what is happening here in the city with the Division of Police, but I ask people to look at the facts. And the other point I want to capitalize on that Mrs. Sydnor made, and it relates to, and I think what she was getting at is the holistic approach to all the things that we're talking about. You know, I made the statement early on in 2015. The consent decree process is a small piece of what needs to happen, not just in this city, but across the country. We can have a perfect police department here in this city. We're still going to have systemic racism. We're still going to have poverty. We're still going to have an education system that needs a lot of improvements, a healthcare system that needs a lot of improvements. We're still going to have people that commit crimes, even if our police agency is perfect. So again, this is an opportunity. Just like this summer was an opportunity for us to really do something that makes substantial changes in the way that we do business as a society, not just as law enforcement or the criminal justice system or policing. It has to be bigger than that. And I see the poster behind my friend from the NAACP, the bigger picture. We have to see the bigger picture. It's not always black and white. We have to look at all these things that come together that make our society. And it's not just about policing. Thanks.
Thank you. Peter, any other
Yes.
Any other people
Yes.
who want to be heard?
Well, we do have people who want to be heard, and I am going to start off with, I have two questions here. A bigger question: how will Governor DeWine's stand your ground law impact CPD's implementation of the consent decrees? It's a curious question. I want to raise it. People want to raise it. Any takers?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry about that. I don't think it really affects how the division does its job. That stand your ground law is really something of the after effects of an incident. It's that defense that a person is going to use that is used, quote unquote, deadly force to protect themselves. As far as enforcement, I mean, we're going to enforce the laws as they're written. But again, that part of that particular bill that was passed really speaks to the after effects and that criminal justice process, which happens after that use of force.
Okay, great. Let me go to the next question. Does the consent decree strive to address qualified immunity for officers?
Chief Hassan, can you take that one?
I'll take it. It does not.
Okay.
You know, I guess that people ought to understand that qualified immunity is more of a judicial affect than it is a police affect. You make a determination as to whether or not someone had qualified immunity again after the fact, and after it has been raised because of the fact that an officer is either looking at criminal prosecution or there's been some civil case brought where the officer wants to allege that they don't have to be held accountable because they were immune in some kind of qualified way.
Judge Adrine, I appreciate that. I think the community appreciate that because I think we're all learning, and it goes to show how much, you know, how you talked earlier about no question is a wrong question, and I think this is a good example of that clarification. Let me ask another question. It says, can the consent decree be used to shift municipal funding priorities from law enforcement to physical and mental health care, youth programming, and community mediation and reconciliation programs?
Director Langhenry, you want to speak to that?
The consent decree doesn't really address funding priorities or budgeting priorities But I will note that as a result of the consent decree, we did have to put more money into the police division in order to comply with some of the things that we agreed to. For example, creating our whole CPOP program, and we had a commander in charge of that. And all of these things cost more funds. Even the funding of the police commission itself was an additional expenditure for the police. But the consent decree itself does not address that. But hopefully, and I understand the whole notion of shifting our priorities away from policing towards services that may alleviate the need for policing. And I will note that in the consent decree, there is the crisis intervention piece of it, and the relationships that we've forged with the community on that piece and the importance that's on there. Hopefully that's a way to shift things away from policing and towards getting services for the folks who need them. The first class of specialized crisis intervention officers was just finished, and those folks are ready to be deployed. And hopefully that is a way for us to feed folks towards resources that will be better able to assist them with their needs. But the decree itself doesn't really address budget priorities.
Okay, thank you. I have two quick things I'd like to do before we call it a night. And I know we're under a little bit of time pressure, but the first is to say that I think we'd be remiss if we didn't ask Attorney Brennan to at least speak to the current status of the Tamir Rice case, whether or not that case is completely over, or whether there are still some things that can still be pursued, and what kind of community reaction did the U.S. Attorney's Office see after the decision was made to close that out?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the Tamir Rice case is so heartbreaking and so unfair, frankly, because of what we now know. I mean, it was a 12-year-old boy with a toy in a park, and it is hard for anybody to wrap their mind around how a situation like that, a boy in a park with a toy, ends up being shot by police. And it's been very challenging for the community, the department, the FBI, our office. We put considerable time and resources into answering the question that we had to answer, which was it criminal? And the law really constrains us in a lot of ways, as it does with any type of offense. But with respect to a civil rights offense, you know, we have to look at whether or not the officer's conduct was unreasonable, and also whether or not it was done willfully, so with the intent to deprive someone of a constitutional right. And when we look at reasonableness, the law says we can only look at what the officers knew at the time force was used. What is learned later, so Tamir's age, the fact that it was a toy gun, that information is not something that we as prosecutors can weigh in terms of determining whether or not we could prove unreasonable use of force. It's not something we could present to a jury. And in fact, if we were in trial and that evidence came out, there's a specific jury instruction that must be read that tells a jury that they cannot factor after acquired information to determine whether or not the officer's use of force was unreasonable. The officers in this instance, you know, what they learned from dispatch, we know, was an incomplete capture of the information. It was a code 1 assessment for an adult in a park pointing a gun. We know that the 911 caller gave additional information, suspected Tamir was a juvenile, suspected that perhaps it was a toy gun, but that information was not relayed to the officers. And so with that information, they approached, they obviously came in their car, they saw movements that cannot be deemed unreasonable given the circumstances. And unfortunately, a 12-year-old boy who had likely no appreciation for what his movements at that time could mean. He lost his life. And there's just no way of getting around the tragedy of that. There's no way I could ever comprehend what his family's going through. And I think that from a community standpoint, what I have seen and I have heard is that there's a lot of anger and a lot of grief, and there's a lack of understanding of how this can happen. We can know these facts, and there isn't a criminal prosecution. We laid out the analysis, the legal analysis that we must apply in a press release, compared it to the facts, and expressed to the community what the conclusion is. But it's, look, you can study the law you want. I certainly do it myself. Obviously, that's my job. And I'm never going to feel it's okay that Tamir lost his life that day. I don't think anybody's going to ever reach that point. But we've seen lawful protests. We've heard requests to reopen the investigation, reconsider the investigation. I can't speak to whether or not somebody in the department may at some point decide to do that. So I can't hypothesize as to whether or not, or what the future could actually be. Given the facts, I don't know where that would necessarily go, but I think what we can all do is learn from what happened and use this consent decree, particularly in the city of Cleveland, to try to make sure that what happened that day doesn't happen again. I mean, we were not able to criminally prosecute with respect to Mr. Henderson or Ms. Williams or Mr. Russell, and not also with respect to Tamir, but it doesn't mean that those incidents haven't given us a launching pad to really demand change and reform and improve the way policing is done in the city. And so that's where I think there can still be a lot of improvement made for Cleveland.
Okay, thank you. Last question I'll put to Chief Aden. You're in the first extension year of the consent decree. There's the possibility of one more extension year after this. Where do you think we're going to end up?
Judge, that's pretty broad. We've got a lot of work to do, and we want to do it quickly, but we need to do it effectively and in a thoughtful manner. As I explained earlier, there are many stages to this consent decree. We are now entering the stage where we are assessing where the division stands with regard to all of its policies, with regard to all of the requirements in the consent decree. We hope in a perfect setting that we can get this done within the next couple of years. And we're holding everyone accountable to these timelines. We, next week, will publish, or will file the 2021 monitoring plan. That'll be a public filing that will have all of the dates and timelines of what we expect to get accomplished in 2021. I believe we will go longer than that. But again, we're in a mode now where we're starting to really assess where the division stands and whether the consent decree mandates are in practice, meaning, okay, is that how they operate?
Thank you. I think we are at time. And so I'm going to kick it back for final words from the host.
I would like to thank Judge Ronald Adrine for moderating this evening's community conversation. We were provided background for the consent decree from multiple perspectives. I'd also like to thank again the panelists for lending their expertise and perspectives to this important topic to the community. And finally, a thanks to our sponsors, Cuyahoga Community College and Rockwell Automation, as well as our community partners. Our next segment will be coming up in just a few weeks on February 10th, where Rick Jackson, senior host producer at Ideastream, will moderate a discussion on the use of force, including vehicle pursuit. The Cleveland Division of Police recently made important changes to some of its force policies. Building on these improvements, the Cleveland Division of Police will revise force policies, training, supervision, and accountability systems so that any use of unreasonable force is promptly identified and responded to appropriately. Please join us for this important topic by registering through our website at unitedwaycleveland.org. And thank you again for joining us, and have a good evening.